Welcome to YogiViews, where my guest is yoga itself, through interviewing those who practice it, teach it, sell it, or simply love it. I am Antonio Sausis. Yoga emphasizes the importance of spirituality, and as it spread in the Western world, it was met with resistance by some religions, particularly Christianity. Some think that the issue was resolved by the creation of what's today known as Christian yoga, a form of yoga that combines two essential goals: becoming physically healthy and spiritually healthy through yoga practice by calming the mind and quieting ourselves to the point that we can tune out the world's frequency and tune into God's frequency. If we take a deep look at some of Jesus' principles and methods, we can find insightful parallelisms with many of yoga's core concepts, to the point that some affirm that Jesus was one of the greatest yogis of all times. In most religions, the teachings are summarized in scriptures, and Christianity is not an exception, and presents its core principles in the Bible's New Testament Gospels, written accounts revealed by God and that describe the life of Jesus. 4 of these Gospels, Matthew's, Mark's, Luke's, and John's, are considered to be an accurate and authoritative representation of Jesus' real life. The inclusion of these Gospels in the New Testament was decided about 300 years after Jesus was around by Constantine, a Roman ruler whose primary interest was to centralize the power of the state, and who chose those 4 because they assured a coherence with the ideas he intended to guide the new state. There are accounts of other Gospels, even including the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Thomas, that primarily talks about Jesus' teachings. History teaches us that after deciding which Gospels to include and which to omit, Constantine then made sure the banished ones were destroyed, along with the people who continued to read them. Despite his efforts, some of these Gospels survived and have seen the light in later years, leading to an intriguing question. Was Jesus a yogi? To shine some light on this matter, I've invited a special guest today, Reverend George McLaird. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
George McLaird has been in the ministry since 1968 and served 4 Presbyterian churches. Prior to retiring from Parish ministry in 2001, he served the Sausalito Presbyterian Church as pastor for 26 years, and currently he's the Pastor Emeritus there. For almost a decade now, he's been teaching spiritual living at 4 different residential recovery programs. His class is not about religion, but rather about spiritual living, which is being as healthy as possible every day in every way. While religion is pre-packaged with approved rituals, readings, songs, and worship styles, spiritual living encourages people to choose what they find nourishing to their body, mind, and spirit. Now, in his new book, A Guide for Spiritual Living, he gives several hundred suggestions for nourishing oneself physically, mentally, and spiritually. George, I'd like to ask you the question that most people want to know about, and that is, what was your first experience with yoga?
16 years ago, I went on a retreat. There were about a dozen of us there. And the first night, the instructor was giving the details of what we were going to do and so forth. And one of the women raised her hand and she said that I am a yoga teacher and I'm going to do yoga every morning. And anybody here who wants to participate, feel free. Now, I knew nothing of yoga. And so I naively said, is that before or after breakfast? And and with that, she laughed, and so did most of the other people. She told me, she said, you never eat very much before yoga. So I went the next morning and did the exercises and didn't think much of it. And then the next morning I woke up and I was sore in every part of my body. I couldn't believe it, that something that seemed so simple was so profound. And I said to myself, I need to be doing this. Because I found out that I was stiff, I did not have good balance, and I couldn't move my head very far. But I didn't realize it because that had snuck up on me over the years, and I had become stiff without realizing it. So I went home and told my wife, and we signed up, and that was 16 years ago.
So your first encounter with yoga was with the asana, with the physical practice of it?
Yes, only. There was nothing spiritual or mental or anything. It all had to do with getting your body, getting in touch with your body. That's what it was all about.
And when did you have your first experience with the mental or the meditative aspects of yoga?
Well, intellectually, I'd had it several years earlier. I graduated, as you mentioned, in 1968 from seminary, and by 1972, I was ready to get out of the ministry. And the reason I was going to get out is that I could not buy all of the details of all of the theologies of the dogma. And it didn't seem to me that it was right for me to spend my life teaching things that I had questions about. So as a part of leaving, I went to a creativity class. And what we did is we meditated that day. It was the first time in my life I'd ever meditated. And I had a magnificent experience. And it changed everything about what went on. So on the way home, I saw a woman in a car next to me who I had worked with, and I rolled down the window and honked the horn, and we pulled over, and I told her about my experience. And she said that she had been a meditator for about 8 years, and she says, "Why don't you come into my place and I'll show you all the books." Well, I was busy. I couldn't do it for a couple of weeks, so I went, and she introduced me to Paramahansa Yogananda and the autobiography of yoga, and eventually the Eternal Quest and all of that. So now here is the first Hindu missionary to the United States, who in his material is talking about Jesus in an extremely loving way and identifying what he teaches and practices with Jesus. And it was mind-opening. It just opened my mind. And instead of then staying in the ministry teaching theologies, which I have questions about, I switched to daily living, or what I now call spiritual living. Because all the theologies, you can say, well, yes, it might be that way, or no, it probably isn't that way, or you have a lot of questions. But on a daily level, if someone, for example, is drinking a quart of vodka a day, you can see that. And you can tell very much that that is a very, very unhealthy thing to do. I use that as an illustration because I teach at 2 residential drug programs, and there are people who drink that much. So I just thought that, and then of course if we're going to stay with the Christian terminology, it would be teaching people to live in a Christ-like way. But the way I identify it nowadays is just being healthy in body, mind, and spirit. So when I then came to physical yoga, that also had an Eastern flavor, it wasn't a big deal to me. Because I had already been introduced years earlier to Paramahansa Yogananda and the Self-Realization Fellowship.
Now, what were some of the difficulties you personally encounter in your path? Because you were just referring to the fact that there was somehow a possible divorce or a possible not completing it because you were not finding a coherence, and so then yoga. How did you end up merging or reconciling the Christianity in yoga?
Well, I did it by emphasizing the daily living as opposed to the theology. For example, is there an afterlife? I hope so, but I'm not going to tell you that there absolutely is because I don't know enough to be able to say that. Was Jesus divine or was he just a man? All of these questions. I mean, there were hundreds of them that I had, and I'd had since I was a child. And one day I realized there's no way I can find that out. And in order to stay in the ministry, then I had to go to the street where people really live, where divorces happen and where families are not functioning well and where people are unhappy with their life and with their vocation and having trouble with their children. And that's the level that I wanted to be on. And that's where I've been since 1972.
In very general terms, a yogi is led to realize the transitory and ephemeral nature of the phenomenal world and to discriminate in the real from the unreal. Also to renounce to all desires for worldly pleasures and bodily comforts. And Jesus lived a life of seclusion, cutting off all connections with earthly friends and relatives, and having or not having a home or possessions of his own. Do you think this could be seen as a sign of Jesus' yogic nature?
Well, that interpretation of Jesus is absolutely a connection. I mean, it's almost a blueprint for how you do it and how you get there. Unfortunately, or fortunately, wherever, there are a lot of versions of Jesus. As you mentioned in your introduction, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they have a very earthly Jesus. Jesus who was in the streets, he was eating with sinners, and he was called a glutton and a drunkard, which today we would call an alcoholic. And that's a very earthly Jesus that was presented there. Thomas and the Gnostics and other people, they had a mystical Jesus who was very, very, very much in line with what we see as yoga practice and yoga philosophy.
Yoga bases the success in spiritual practice in two very important principles. And one is practice and the other one is non-attachment. And we know that Jesus worked incessantly. He did that for others. He was unattached to the fruits of his actions. Was he following one of these principles, non-attachment?
Well, if you're going to buy the Thomas version and the mystical version, then the answer is absolutely yes. And that is the one that resonates with me. I like that version much better than the other version because my daily life has proven that that is the more substantial way to go. And the other one is kind of, it confuses me.
In what way?
Well, in the sense that I can't prove that. Now, when I see Jesus as a mystic, and I do the practice of meditation, and I do the practice of yoga, I see that works. But when I just stick with my brain and deal with theology and the teachings of the church and all of that sort of thing, then I say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And so if I'm going to go with my intuition as to which of these versions is the most authentic, I stick with Jesus, the mystic, Jesus, the yogi.
Now, he promoted the good of his fellow men in all possible ways. He directed them to the path of righteousness and spiritual realization, and it was mainly through unselfish works. Do you think this was his idea of practice, the second core principle of yoga's success in spiritual life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If there is not service to other people, it is not an authentic spiritual path. And that doesn't mean that we constantly, help other people to a detriment of ourselves, but it is there. And here's how I got to that. When I first started flying, I did not like the opening speech that you get on every single flight. The part that, if the oxygen mask comes out of the ceiling, you put yours on first, then you help other people. And I thought that was really selfish. But then I dated a flight attendant who, incidentally, I married. And we've been married 29 years now.
Wow.
And we're just about ready to go to our 30th year. Anyway, so I told her one day that I didn't like that. And she said, well, do you know why it's that way? And I said, no. She said, because in some cases, you would only have 10 seconds of consciousness. And if you have a child with you, or an elderly person who is dependent on you, they are going to go unconscious and maybe die. And so it is an act of love to first put your oxygen mask on and then help other people. And I believe that that is the principle when it comes to our doing meditation, our doing yoga, and all the other things we do. It looks like it's selfishness, that we're indulging in our own practice. But the truth is we are preparing to be of great service to others.
Well, and also, I'd like to use an example sometimes to illustrate this, because if there was any possible way in which I could live your life, I should be able to breathe your life through my nose. Correct?
If you could do that.
If I could do that, if there was any possibility of that being real,
Yeah.
then, but otherwise, since I can only breathe my life through my nose, then it is kind of a given that then I need to take care of myself and love myself and be tuning to myself. There are some known branches of yoga that address this union we're talking about, the union of all existing things, and the union with spirit in different ways. One of them is karma yoga. It's based on the fact that every action generates a reaction, a concept that exemplifies the union that yoga speaks about. Jesus said, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall also reap." Does this mean, or does this make Jesus a karma yogi?
Well, it certainly lines him up with the idea of karma. You don't plant oats and you get an apple tree. Mm-hmm. And in our daily life, if we are living in a very, very unhealthy way and expect to be healthy, we're going to find out that after a while that doesn't work. So it does line up. It uses different words. And there are many Christians who are offended by the word karma. But
How so?
Well, because they've been taught that it's a Hindu term, and they are so set in the fact that they are right as Christians, that they reject everything else. Now, you see, I know this from personal experience because I was raised in a household like that. I was raised in an extreme, conservative, fundamentalist Christian home.
Your parents were ministers?
Yes, they were ministers. And therefore, we were taught one simple thing. We are right, and everybody else is wrong.
Wow.
The people who disagreed with us are wrong. That's the way it was. And I believed that for many years, which, children believe what their parents tell them in most cases. But then when I started to read and I started to think and I started to get exposed to other ideas, I realized that this was just one version of how to live. And that there is a spirituality in other religions and other peoples and in other cultures that I was blind to for a long while. In that way, I'm no longer blind.
Yeah.
Because I see that there are wonderful spiritual paths, and there are thousands of them, not just one.
Well, as Swami Satchitananda said, there's one truth, many paths
There you go.
to that truth, but there's just one, that one truth. Another of the important aspects of yoga or branches of yoga is bhakti yoga. And it's a form that promotes the union with the divine through developing unconditional love amongst us men, as God's love is unconditional for us. Complete self-surrender and absolute self-resignation are some of the principal virtues of a bhakti yogi. And these are virtues that Christ exhibited himself. Was he a bhakti yogi?
Well, again, he was in different words. Mm-hmm. And I think that really is what all this comes down to, is if you don't get caught up in the word, that it's a foreign word, that it's a word of a different religion, and therefore it's wrong and bad, and you have to stay away from it. But you go into the inner concept of the word, then you see that he lines up. He lines up with a lot of other masters. I say that Jesus was a spiritual genius, and I like that terminology. He was a master teacher, and he was, a great soul who saw a lot more than most people do. and certainly more than others in his time. And I'll tell you how I kind of shifted with all of that. And in a very secular way too, but it makes sense to me now. I was studying one of the statements by Abraham Lincoln, and he writes, "All men are created equal." You remember that statement? And I said to myself, wait a minute, not all men are created equal. So there are tall ones and short ones and fat ones and thin ones and rich ones and poor ones and healthy ones and sick ones. That doesn't work. So it took me several years to think about what he was really saying. And I think what he was getting to is this: every person on earth is equally important. And since I have adopted that as one of my philosophies, I can sit in my car and watch people walk by when I'm at a red light and see that that person is just as important as me. The child is just as important as the adult. And it has brought great compassion into my life that I didn't have before. And that's how I got it. You know, I mean, I heard that you're supposed to be compassionate. I read that you're supposed to be compassionate, but I didn't know how to get there. And that's one of the things that happened to me that got me there.
That's a good experience about compassionate understanding.
Yeah.
Now, as you know, one of the things that yoga says is that our minds tend to function in a dualistic way. So darkness is different from light. But the truth is that darkness is the absence of light. Light is the presence of light. We're still talking light.
Yeah.
We have not changed the subject. Perhaps it's something we can apply this to what you were saying, in the sense that yes, we are different, but there is a similarity. We're still talking human, we're still talking beings, even though some are young, some are old, some are fat, some are... Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. See, I now believe that everybody on earth is on a spiritual path. But there are some very dark spiritual paths. And so the psychopath, for example, might choose a path of giving and receiving pain, but there are other ways. There are ways of joy and happiness and lightness and service. And it is just, it is opening up the possibility and getting people who are on a dark and destructive spiritual path to get on a positive and forward-looking path that's healthy. I use the word health a lot in my work because I think it's more accurate. You know, I'm not really interested in people teaching people how to laugh or to be happy, because if they get healthy, they are going to laugh.
They naturally.
And you know, it's just going to naturally bubble out. And so that's why I stick with the word health quite a bit.
Now, as you know, in many parts of yoga, we talk about loving compassion. What is the place of love in this? Because it's also, Christ was big in love and in the heart as the loving organ of spirituality.
Well, going back to the Course in Miracles, it says there are two emotions, love and fear. And so what we are attempting to do, again, just as we did if we were trying to bring somebody who is on a dark, low, destructive path into a high, light, healthy path. So if somebody is experiencing hate and they're very, very nasty and we don't like them, we need to remind ourselves that they are going through a fear place, and we need to bring them up out of that. And we do that by setting the example. That's a powerful way to do it. And if they ask us questions, then we can tell them how we made that shift. And then, of course, we know that there are different kinds of love. There's the fuzzy, happy, beautiful, all the world is perfect now that I'm with you love. And then there's tough love. And I think when it comes to yogis and listening to their gurus and the masters, there's some tough things said there. And it's kind of like, sometimes the guru says to the patient or the student, you need to do ABC, or you need to stop doing ABC. And so there's some tough moments of learning there.
Now, as part of this possible tough aspect, it is also said in yoga that the doors to God are always open, and that this implies an advantage and a disadvantage. The disadvantage, of course, the advantage is that you can always walk in.
Yep.
The disadvantage, of course, is that you can always walk out. Now, this is, if I'm not incorrect, slightly different from what religions propose, which is if you do these things and if you don't do these ones, then you're out of God. Then you're out of the kingdom, thou shalt not come in. Yeah. So this is very different.
It's extremely different because the door is always open, and all you have to do is walk through the door. But religions have a tendency to say you have to walk through this door. And if you walk through this door, you're in, and if you don't walk through this door, you're actually walking into illusion. And another thing that I have heard said is, my God is the only true one, and all other explanations of God are false, or they're presenting a counterfeit God that really doesn't exist. And I think all of these explanations of God need to be embraced rather than denied. And I love the pluralistic nature of spirituality. And it's really the basis of what I teach.
This concludes the first part of a two-part show where I'm interviewing George McLaird. George McLaird has been in the ministry since 1968 and served 4 Presbyterian churches. Prior to retiring from Parish ministry in 2001, he served the Sausalito Presbyterian Church as pastor for 26 years, and currently he's the Pastor Emeritus there. For almost a decade now, he's been teaching spiritual living, a class, a program that he teaches at 4 different residential recovery programs. And his class is not about religion, but rather about spiritual living, which is being as healthy as possible every day in every way. While religion is prepackaged with approved rituals, readings, songs, and worship styles, spiritual living encourages people to choose what they find nourishing for their body, their mind, and their spirit now. In his new book, A Guide for Spiritual Living, he gives several hundred suggestions for nourishing oneself spiritually, mentally, and physically. I hope you like our show today. And if you care to let me know, shoot me an email at antonio@yogiviews.com. I hope to see you the next time.